In this video, we'll be installing an Upstream O2 sensor in this 2007 Mazda CX-9. We'll be doing the upper O2 sensor in the back of the motor. You will need to remove your intake and throttle body to access it. So the first thing we're going to do is disconnect our negative battery terminal here. It's going to be a 10 millimeter. I'll just loosen this up enough and we can get this to spin and twist right off. Now, if you really want to, and we will, go ahead and disconnect the positive as well because we will be working with fuel. I'll take all the precautions we can. We'll set this aside as well. So now moving forward from our battery, we have our intake or our fresh air duct here held in by a few 10 millimeter bolts. We'll go ahead and remove those. Now this third 10 millimeter bolt here is actually down to the bracket to our air filter housing. So you can take this bolt off or the one down lower. We're just going to take the entire bracket off. Next we're going to work on our air filter or our air intake box here. If we follow this back here, we have a plug. On the bottom of our plug we have a little security or a little red tab on there we're going to have to pull out. So we're going to use a pick tool. Just get under there and pull that red tab out. And we can reach underneath, press the tab, and separate our plug. If we follow this harness straight down, we have a little tab holding this harness into our air box. We're just going to pull that straight up. And we'll set that harness aside. So now what we're going to do is open our air filter box here. We're going to push these two metal tabs inward, and that will open our air box. So now because we are going to remove this whole air intake tube, we're going to loosen up our 10 millimeter back here, or our Phillips, for our band clamp, and we'll remove the top of our air filter box. Now to remove our box, we've undid our clips. We're going to lift that backside straight up. We have three tabs in front. We're going to lift this air intake up and pull it out of those tabs. Because we loosened up our band clamp, we can now twist and pull the top of our air filter box off. So the next thing we're going to disconnect is this hose going into our air intake. I'm just going to pull that straight out. We can set that aside. So now if we lift the rest of our air intake tube, you'll see one hard line here, which is going to be clipped in by a little security lock back here. We're going to need to remove this line. So we're going to open up that clip just by pulling it out and forward. And then remove our line. Now if we follow our air intake tube back just before our throttle body, under these hoses here, we have another band clamp. This is going to be a 10 millimeter. Go ahead and loosen that up. With that loosened up, we can then work our intake tube off. So now we're going to remove our engine cover. To do that, we're going to need to open or remove our oil fill cap. I'm just going to twist that, take that out, set it aside. I'm going to grab a hold of your engine cover, pull it straight up. Now on the back side, it'll be held in place by two grommets and two pins. Once you have that off, you can go ahead and put your oil cap back on. Set your engine cover aside. Now we're going to remove our air filter and air intake box. It's held in on the bottom by 2 pins into 2 rubber grommets. I'm just going to grab a hold of this box, pull it straight up. So now underneath our throttle body, you'll see a bracket mounted to our throttle body and to the block. We're going to remove the top bolt connecting it to the throttle body itself. It's going to be a 5/16 bolt. So now moving directly above our throttle body, we have a few hoses here, a little regulator, and a 10mm nut. We're going to remove that nut and these pieces and just move them out of the way slightly so we have a little more access to work back here in our intake. There's your nut. All right, we have one more on the bottom, on the back side here. Alright, we're just going to pull this straight back. Try not to bend these lines too much. They are fuel. We're just going to sit them aside so we have a little bit more access up here. If we want to, and you want to, we can put your nuts back in place so we don't lose them. So now our throttle body has an electronic plug right here with a security lock on it. We're going to pull that lock up and reach in there, press the tab, and pull that plug right off. Alright, so continuing with the throttle body, we have another line right here with a little lock on it. So what we're going to do is pop that lock up. Alright, before we go any further, we're going to take a couple of rags and just sit them down in this area. And with that lock all the way up, we're going to pull that line back. And sit that line aside. Okay, so now working towards removing our intake, we have a harness right here that's connected into the intake, and we have this large harness across the front that's also connected to the intake. We have some plastic clips holding them in place. So with our panel tool, we'll go ahead and pop those clips out. There's one there. And just move that harness aside. That'll gain us access to these bolts here. Moving across the front, we have another one here. And you should have, our harness is actually exposed. The shielding that's supposed to be around this is missing, but you should have 1, 2, 3 clips across the front of your intake. We can go ahead and remove those now. So now if we look at the top of our intake and look straight in the back, we have one more bolt kind of facing the driver's side corner. We come in with a few extensions, and again a 5/16. So now coming across the side and front of our intake here, we have a few bolts. They're going to be 5/16. We're going to go ahead and take these out. All right, on this side here, we have 2 more. And then right up top here, we have one more. Okay, so now with our bolts removed across the front, we can start to work off our intake. Now at this point, remember your throttle body is going to come along with it. We still have two hoses in the very back we need to disconnect. Alright, so once you get your intake far enough forward that you can get to one or both of your hoses, go ahead and disconnect them as soon as you can. Well, right now I have access to this rear hose straight back here. Okay, so this hose back here, we were going to disconnect on the hose clamp, but it actually came out of our valve cover. So we have an electrical connection right underneath this hose, and we can't actually see it. So we're going to go ahead and remove this hose. Okay, so here's our plug. Go ahead and disconnect that. Okay, now we can continue to work out our intake. Again, when you have your intake out this far, you have an open engine. Do not drop anything in here. If you need to at this point, just to be safe, take some rags and go ahead and fill these holes as soon as possible. That way you don't drop any bolts or any debris down into your engine. If you can only get to a couple right now, that's fine. Just be very careful. Alright, so our intake is almost ready to come out. Still working towards one hose. Which is right back here. I think at this angle here, we can get a long pair of needle nose in here and remove that clamp. See if we can get that line to free up. There we go. Okay, now our intake should be free to come out of the vehicle. And we can just lift our intake right up and out. So now that we have our intake out of the way, we can fill up these last few holes here with some rags. Just don't push these too far in where you can't get them out. Okay. So now that we have our intake removed, we can see here in the back, here is our oxygen sensor. Is the cable, runs up behind this bracket to our plug. So the first thing we're going to do is unplug our O2 sensor. I'm going to push down on this tab, separate the plug. Okay, now with our O2 sensor harness loose, we can take our oxygen sensor socket, Put it down on the oxygen sensor and start to loosen it up. So we have here for access an offset oxygen sensor socket and a swivel with an extension. Now we can spin that oxygen sensor out. Alright, so now we can lower in our new oxygen sensor. And what we want to do here is get this snugged up and torqued down before we plug in the new plug. Okay, we got that snugged up. Now we'll torque it down. Okay, now we'll torque it down to 35 foot-pounds. We'll remove our socket. And we can take our harness now and plug it in. Just push until you hear the click. And that's it. Now that you've removed your intake and you're ready to put it back in the vehicle, we always suggest that you replace your gaskets. So we have here our old gaskets. We're going to remove them. You can see in front we have our new gaskets. So we'll either use a pick tool or a small pocket flathead screwdriver to pop these old gaskets out. You can see we have some oil residue here. So before we put our new gaskets in place, we're going to give these areas here a good clean. We'll also come in with just a little bit of brake clean. Okay, we'll flip this up and just give these areas where the gaskets go a little clean. Now at this point, if you want to, you can use some compressed air to blow these dry, but the brake clean will evaporate pretty quickly. Once that's dried up, we'll put our new gaskets in. So now that we have our intake here cleaned, we can go ahead and put our new gaskets in place. So we're going to line up these little tabs here with the tabs on the outside, and we'll just press into place. And I want to make sure you press these down all the way evenly. So we'll go across these 2 times just to make sure. All right, once we're happy with that one, we'll move on to the next. Same exact process. You can see here that these aren't set in all the way. So we'll just pull this back up, try again. Once you have your gaskets all the way in to their grooves, we're ready to take it to the vehicle. So now before we put our intake onto this surface here with our new gaskets, we're going to clean this area up and make sure we have the best seal possible. So we're going to use a little brake clean, a rag, and lightly with a razor blade. Again, when you do this, even though you have rags in these runners here, you want to pull your debris away from the center. You don't want to drop it in, or at least do the best you can not to. Take a razor blade lightly. All right, once you're happy with the cleaning of this surface here, we are ready to remove our rags from our runners and put our intake back in place. Okay, so now we have our intake ready to go back in. Pull our rags. Again, try and pull the debris out. Now we can take our intake and rest it back down into position. Now remember, on the back here we have a hose that we'll need to connect. So what we'll actually do is take this hose right off of the intake, plug it down onto the valve cover in the back, and then we'll set our intake in place. Okay. So now, before we go any further with bolting in our intake or connecting anything else, if you remember, we have one plug right around this hose area here. So we're going to lift our intake and angle it a little bit as if we were going to take it back out again. Now here's that plug, and it's going to go right underneath this pipe here. So we'll connect that back up. Okay, now that we have that plugged in, we'll put this hose back on and put our hose clamp back into place. First thing we're going to do here is actually spin our hose clamp for a little bit easier access. Okay, so we'll work our intake backwards and put that hose back in. And reinstall your hose clamp. So now, with our intake located, we can put our bolts back in. We're going to have one long bolt. The long bolt is going to go up in the center. All right, you're going to have 5 other bolts that are going to be the same length, and they're going to go all around the front. So we're just going to drop these into place. We're going to press down and get our intake as far down seated as we can, and we'll start to thread in a couple of these bolts. Okay, we're just going to loosely snug them up. I'm going to start them by hand to make sure we're not cross-threading them and we are actually on the holes. Okay, now that we have our bolts just loosely snugged up, just to the point where we were putting downward pressure on them, we are going to come back and torque these down to 80 inch-pounds, and we're going to do that in a sequence. So we're going to start here. Up top. Back here. And if you decide you want to, you can run back through and just make sure everything is torqued down correctly. Now working outwards towards our throttle body, we have a couple of connections here. One of them is going to be the hose in the back. All right, so we have this fuel style connector with our lock, and you can see where it connects in the back here. I'm just going to press that all the way up into that rib. Make sure we're over that rib, and then press our lock down and give it a little pull back just to make sure we are locked in place. So now across our throttle body we have our plug here. Our plug is right here, also with a lock on it. So we'll press this back into place and press our lock in. Now just above our throttle body we have our bracket with our nuts that we left here so we wouldn't lose them. And this piece here, which will go right back onto the rubber isolators, and we can thread our nuts back on. And tighten those down. So now underneath our throttle body, we have one more bolt holding it to a bracket to the block. Well, the bracket has shifted slightly, so we're just going to use a pry bar, push that bracket up a little bit. And we can tighten that bolt down. And then we have one bolt straight back here. Now, the last thing to do here is with this harness, we're going to take it and put that wire clip right back in. Now our vehicle only has one clip right here, which will go into this part of the intake. You should have three, one here, one in the center, and one on the end. Now we'll probably end up putting a couple of zip ties right here, but that's where you would plug yours back in. So now we're going to reinstall our air filter box and our air intake tube here. There are going to be two pins on the bottom of this. We're going to seat straight down into the two grommets there. If you locate the top holes here, it should help you get those two pins relatively close. Once you feel you're there, just push straight down, lock them in. And then up top here we have 3 bolts to reinstall. So now moving a little further back, we're going to install our intermediate tube here. You'll see on the back you have a little notch that you're going to need to align with your throttle body. Once we have that aligned, we'll tighten down our band clamp. And now we'll tighten down the band clamp. Now if we lift up this intake tube, we can see we have a port here. We have our hard line here that's going to attach to it. On our hard line, we have a little gray tab. We're going to need to pull that tab open as we push onto this tube. That's going to be your lock. So we'll pull that open, seat that tube in, and release that lock. Now the last part is our air filter housing top. So what we're going to do is push this right into our tube here. I'm going to line up our notches. And we can set that down. From here, we're going to plug in our sensor. Sensor also has a lock on the plug. Push it straight in, and then push your lock in. So now we have one last hose. Push it straight into our tube. And just after that, we have our band clamp. Once we're sure our intake box top here is all the way in, we can tighten down that band clamp. So now for our air filter housing top, we're going to put these 3 tabs right into these 3 slots. I'm going to push into the driver's side and straight down. If you can't get these 3 tabs lined up, make sure your air filter is fully seated correctly. Once you have your 3 tabs in front set in and your air filter is nice and tight here, we can pull these 2 metal clips up and over, pull them to lock in. And the last thing we have here is this clip for our harness. Pushes right down into the top of your air filter box. So now to replace our engine cover, we need to remove our oil fill cap. Spin that right out. We can set this aside. To take our engine cover, we're looking for our 2 little knobs here. We're going to line them up into that intake we just installed. Easiest thing to do is line up your oil fill in the hole here. It'll put you really close, and give it a little tap down there, one in the bottom corner. Then you can go ahead and reinstall your oil fill cap. So now we can reconnect our battery. First thing we're going to do is connect our negative terminal. So we're going to seat that down as far as possible and tighten it up. Give it a little push, make sure it doesn't rotate or spin, it's not loose. We can now move on to the positive. Positive terminal, we're going to pull this boot back a little bit here. Open that up. Do the same thing with our positive. Push it down as far as we can get it. Tighten up that nut. Give it a little push, make sure it doesn't spin, make sure it's not loose. We can pull that boot forward and cover up that terminal.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.